Hello everyone, we are now starting with chapter 6. This one is about surveys and observations, so these are two different ways of measuring what people are doing. So when we're talking about this, we're going to talk about construct validity of surveys and polls. If you remember what validity is talking about, is it measuring what we want it to measure? And so we're wondering, are surveys and polls, which are going to be synonymous here, measuring what we want? The second thing is the same idea, construct validity, but of behavioral observations. So first, construct validity of surveys and polls. So a survey and poll we're going to treat as synonymous for this class. It's just a method of asking people questions where they self-report. So with surveys and polls, we're going to talk about choosing question formats. So there are different ways that you can format your question. Second is writing well-worded questions, which can be more challenging than you might think. And third is encouraging accurate responses. So first, when we're talking about choosing question formats, there are 4 types that the book goes into. The first, open-ended questions. So this just allows them to answer any way that they want. So an example of that would be, what do you think of this class? So they could say, it's good, or I love it so much. It can be anything. The second one, the forced choice format, this is similar, but it's now forcing different possible options. So for example, do you like this class so far? And response options could be yes, no, or neutral. A very specific type of forced choice format is this Likert scale. A Likert scale is a type of scale that we give them that gives them certain types of options. So they can answer, for example, how difficult is this class? The answer could be very easy, easy, neutral, difficult, or very difficult. You've probably seen these. They can be anything from, do you strongly agree to strongly disagree, very easy to very difficult, stuff like that. This last one, the semantic differential, an example of that would be rate your professor on a scale from 1 to 10, with 1 being show up and pass a class, and 10 being it's the hardest class I've ever taken. He is a really tough professor. So this one is similar to this Likert scale, but it's giving more room, and the numbers are now meaning something, at least at the low end and the top end. Individuals will assume that 5 means somewhere in between. So all of those are ways that you can ask a question in a survey. So these are possible responses that they can give. Here we want to make sure our questions are actually getting at something that we want. So some problems that can pop up. First is this leading question. You'll see this a lot in politics. So here's an example. Do you agree with voter ID laws that will prevent eligible voters from casting their vote? So that kind of question right there, it is leaning in one direction. It's pushing you by saying it will prevent eligible voters from casting their vote. It's not talking about the other side of why you would maybe agree with the voter ID laws. It just presents this negative side. So that's a leading question. These happen all the time. We see them in the news and the media quite a bit. Do you support so-and-so's right to do something? It's always trying to get a certain answer out of you. To make this question not leading is one way we could just say, do you agree with voter ID laws? If we assume that individuals understand what that means, we can just give that to them. If we don't, then we could say, do you agree with voter ID laws that prevent ineligible voters from casting their vote, but also will prevent eligible voters from casting their vote. So it shows both sides a little bit. In your questions, always be looking, am I leading them into the answer I want them to say? And if you are, avoid it. Second one, double-barreled question. You see this a lot. Usually in practice when you're just asking questions, do you enjoy swimming and wearing sunscreen? So there's two questions there. I may enjoy swimming, but I don't like sunscreen. So how do I answer that question? So we always want to ask a single question and a question. Another thing to keep in mind is this negatively worded question. So here's an example. People who do not drive with a suspended license should never be punished. So do I disagree with that statement? I'm not totally sure because it has these negatives in there. Negatives are naturally more difficult for us to understand. So it would take someone reading this question a few times. They would have to say, people who do not drive with a suspended license should never be punished. I guess I disagree with that, but maybe I should read it again. We could change this to say, people who drive with a suspended license should be punished. That is a statement that is easier to say I agree or disagree with. Last thing to keep in mind is this question order. Often we are doing a survey about several topics. Part of that means that some of their previous questions and their responses to those questions could impact how they answer subsequent questions. So for example, this has been found in research looking at gender performance in different fields. They brought people in, asked if they identify as male or female, and then asked them to do things that are supposed to be easier for males than for females. And just by being primed by them saying that I am a female and having some information about it normally being difficult for females, they actually performed worse on that task than the same types of females that weren't primed. So sometimes your question order can actually impact how people answer a subsequent question. So a lot of those can be tough to know right from the beginning, but you can ask yourself, is there any reason why this question could impact a later question? And if so, then maybe change the order of the questions. Sometimes this can be done by putting demographic information, that kind of question information at the very end, after they've done other things. All right, we also want to encourage individuals to give accurate responses. So people can give meaningful responses if we provide the opportunity. But sometimes people use shortcuts. An example of a shortcut is a response set. And this is essentially a way of answering a number of questions the same way. So like strongly agree. You may have done this yourself where you see all these things that normally, yeah, I probably agree with most of these things anyway. So to go faster so you don't have to think as hard, you just strongly agree all the way down. The next one is this yay saying idea, acquiescence, and that is essentially when people want to answer in the way that they believe the researcher is looking for. So, or a way that makes them feel good. So they could ask, how is your life right now? And they can say, well, it's great. It's going really well. I'm very good at school. And so, yeah, I'm great, even if that person is struggling. So yay saying where they try to make themselves look better for the researcher or for themselves. Another way is this fence sitting idea, where it's the shortcut to play it safe by choosing the response in the middle of the scale. So it's, I don't want to make a statement here, so I'll just pick neutral as often as I can. This can be based on either there's different points of view and they don't really have a strong opinion, or they might believe that the researcher might judge them for having that opinion. This actually happened in the 2016 election between President Trump and Hillary Clinton, where Trump things about him, and so people didn't want to support him openly, even if they supported some of his policies. So the polls that were predicting Hillary Clinton to win were biased, because the people that were going to vote for Trump, they would say, we don't really know who we're voting for. They would answer neutral, when really they had made up their mind and they were going to vote for him. So how can we really help with this? So with fence sitting, one solution is to remove the neutral. You force them into one side or the other. This can be tough because there might be some people that truly are neutral. So how can we help with yay saying? Well, one thing, we can try to word questions to make it so it's very clear that the researchers don't have a side that they are looking for. Another way is to provide different priming, where it helps them understand that we want honest feedback and not, we don't want any fluff in there. For response sets, we can put a fake question within the response set, a response that's negatively worded or is totally fake, where it wouldn't make any sense for them to say strongly agree to everything. Because if they said strongly agree to that one, it was in fact something ridiculous, or it was the opposite of what they had said earlier when they said strongly agree. Those usually don't help in the moment, but it helps you understand if that's what they were doing when they were answering the question. So a lot of this happens because, one, they're trying to look good. These participants, they believe there's some things that they want that you are looking for, and it's just natural for us as social beings to try to give them that. Another one is self-reporting more than what they know. So sometimes we have this shortcut in our mind that we actually understand things better than what we do, or we know more than what we could possibly. And so we might actually go with that and report that we actually know more. Also, reporting memories of events. Memories are notoriously variable. They're not concrete. And so when they're self-reporting memories of events, they can have biases, positive or negative, towards that memory that makes it less valid. So an interesting one is when you actually have someone rate a product. So it turns out the ratings on Amazon and the ratings on this Consumer Reports, an independent product rating firm, were not very correlated. What they did find is that consumers' ratings were instead correlated with the cost of the product and the prestige of the brand. So if it's a well-known brand and it costs a lot, it must be good. When in fact we know that's not true. They could give any cost. But because of that, we're biased. We see it as, oh, that must be a really good product. So if part of your study is they're rating something, you want to try to make it as neutral as possible of a product. So we just finished talking about construct validity for surveys and polls, which is where we basically just ask people to tell us. But sometimes that's not going to work super well. We want to actually observe what they're doing. And so this section is all about that. So we look at the construct validity of behavioral observations when we're observing them in practice. So one example of that is observing how much people talk. There's a stereotype that women talk more than men. And so a researcher at the University of Arizona, Matthias Mell, he developed this recorder that would record 30 seconds every so often of what people were talking about across men and women. And then made the comparison how many words were being used across those individuals. What they found was that there was no significant difference between the men and women in the study. So that stereotype of women always talking more than men may not actually hold. Another one is observing hockey moms and dads. The popular media was saying that hockey moms and dads were being very aggressive and negative at these games. So Canadian researchers looked into it. What they actually found was 64% of parents' comments were positive and supportive, and only 4% were negative. So the results did not match what the popular media was saying at the time. Another one, observing families in the evening. We may want to know what types of food-related talk happen in the evening in families. And this chart shows some of that information. So there was these number of words for appreciation, distaste, reward, negotiation, health, pleasure, across both parents and children. So the gray are parents, children are the black. And so for appreciation, they're roughly similar. Distaste, children were far more likely to express that. The reward is far more coming from the parents. Negotiation, a little bit more from the parents. Health, more from the parents. And pleasure, a little bit more from the children. So in this, you actually can kind of see some really cool patterns. You can see parents, I'm a parent, and I am really often offering rewards for them to finish their food. And I'm negotiating. I'm saying, please just finish it. This is healthy. It helps you. And so these three areas I definitely do very often. My kids don't. They'll try to negotiate to get out of things all the time, but they don't talk about a reward or their health. So it makes a lot of sense. But these are from observational research. It's not just me saying what I think happens. This was from actually observing what takes place across some families. Another one is the number of times adults and children laugh. Research has shown that children laugh a great deal more than adults throughout the day. And those are known from observational research. So, observations can be better than self-reports. The key here is if we can make reliable, so consistent, and valid, meaning it measures what we want to measure, observations. So if we can do observational research, that's better than just getting self-reports. It usually gives us a better count. We're not relying on people's memory of things. And it often gives us more in-depth information into what is actually happening. Some issues with this, though, is that there's some threats to observational research. The first one is observer bias, when observers see what they expect to see, and observer effects, when participants confirm observer expectations. So there's some interesting examples here. So first one is bright and dull rats. So researchers gave these students some rats. The rats were randomly assigned to these people. And one of the groups, they said these rats are really smart. The other group, they said the rats are not very smart. And it turns out just being told that one was smarter and one was not, the smarter rats ended up doing a lot better than the not smart rats, even though those rats are all the same. And it was only because of the observers, what they expected. Another one, this picture down here in the corner, it's about Clever Hans. And Clever Hans was a horse who, it was suggested, could add, subtract, multiply, and divide about at a 5th grade level. He was tutored in mathematics by his trainer and would tap his hoof to count. So this claim was made that this horse could actually be taught how to do math. But there's some concern that it could be something that the observer, his trainer, was doing that cued him into what was the accurate response. And so what they did was they had 2 researchers that didn't know what the other one was saying say something to one ear, whisper it, and then the other person would whisper the other thing in the other ear, and see if the horse could figure it out. And it turns out the horse couldn't. It wasn't understanding math or English or German, I think in this case. What it was doing was picking up on cues from his trainer. It was a very smart horse. It was picking up, I want to get a reward, and the trainer is doing something, probably subconsciously, to indicate when he got to the proper number. So, interesting enough, the trainer believed it. He believed that this horse was very smart. He was not trying to trick anyone. He believed it. But the horse was actually smart in a different way, not mathematically. So that example is of a mask design. It's when the observers do not know to which conditions the participants have been assigned, and they are not aware of what the study is about. So in essence, it's saying those that are actually doing the observations are just told what they're supposed to observe, but aren't told anything else about the study. This is essential for good observational research, that they don't play any part in knowing what the researchers are looking for, what they want to find, and don't know which group the participants are in if it's an experiment. So another thing to consider is when you're doing observational research, just being observed can change your behavior. I don't know if you've had that experience. Sometimes when I teach in a class, I'll have my boss show up and he just observes how I teach. And even though I'm very comfortable with my boss being there, it still changes a little bit about what I'm doing because I know there's someone observing me. So there's some ways to try to avoid this thing called reactivity, when you react to being observed. So solution number 1 is blend in. So this picture over here, this individual is behind glass, so these individuals over here cannot see her observing. They can't see her writing things down. Another one is waiting it out. So if that approach isn't possible, what you can do is not collect data until your participants are comfortable with the observer being there. Once they're comfortable, then you can start collecting data. The last one mentioned here is measure the behavior's results. So that means we're not even going to watch the behavior itself, but we know what kind of things come from that behavior. So we're just going to watch for that. So for example, you may have heard of the marshmallow study where they put kids in a room and gave them a marshmallow and said if they didn't eat it, they would be able to get another one really soon. And so what they did is leave. And they were watching, so they did blend in. They had this way of watching. But we could have just measured it based on, is there a marshmallow left over when we get back in the room as a researcher? If the marshmallow's not there, then we know they must have eaten it. If the marshmallow is there, it means they must not have eaten it. So there's a lot of ways we can do this. We can say, if they do this behavior, we know what will happen from it, and so we can just measure that. if we can't find a good way to observe without causing this reactivity. So last idea in this chapter is observing people ethically. I want you to think about this question. Is it ethical for researchers to observe the behaviors of others? So here I say it depends. Consider this, should researchers be able to observe people in public locations? If I go to a park, should I be able to take data on individuals there? What if I ask people to provide their consent? Is it ethical then? These answers are tough. There's no straight answer here. And people have different opinions on whether or not observing people in public locations is ethical or not. The idea is you want to be as ethical as possible and protect the data for any individual that you are collecting data on. The best approach in most cases is to provide them with a consent form saying, we want to collect data, we're just going to observe you, do you consent to that? Our next assignment that's coming up is this consent form. I'm going to have a small lecture to introduce it to you, the assignment. But the idea is we provide them with all this information so they can choose for themselves if they want to participate or not. So that is it for this chapter. We've talked about construct validity of surveys and polls and of observational research. We want to measure things well and accurately, and there's things that can get in the way, and there's ways to work around that.